And ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this webinar, where I'm delighted to introduce Eoin Daly, whose geographical focus, although he's now back in London, has been Southeast Asia. And as such, he has contributed heavily to the detailed analysis and reports conducted by McKinsey Company in their Future of Asia series, which is the subject of this webinar. Eoin joined McKinsey in 1999 in London and served clients across industries, including retail, telecoms, banking, and infrastructure. And I'd now like to turn over to him and ask him to start this webinar with a presentation that he has. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roddy. Thank you, Doug and Andrew, for your support as well, and everybody for joining. I will, being a consultant, I couldn't resist the temptation to share some slides, so bear with me. But we will have plenty of time for discussion, and if you have questions as we go, please, I think you can use the chat function. I'm happy to stop and take them. So, as already mentioned, in McKinsey, we have this series called The Future of Asia. We've published quite a lot of research, videos, perspectives, and so on, and it's available online. So I'd encourage you, if you haven't looked already, to have a look. There's some interesting material there. I think the first point I want to make is, well, I'm going to cover really three things in the presentation. The first is the importance of Asia, how Asia is relevant today and how we see that developing over time. The second is COVID, and what from an economic perspective, what the scenarios, future scenarios may be. And the third is the implications of that, all of that for Asia, and given the future of Asia, given the impact of COVID, what the economic opportunities might be for Asia as a region. So the first thing to say is that, to talk about is the relevance of Asia. So Asia is already very relevant, and I think all of you know that. 2 billion people, 28% of global consumption, over 40% of GDP, adjusting for purchasing power. And by 2040, that will be 3 billion, 40% and over 50%. So already an incredibly important region of the world. What's interesting is that if we look at flows, and one of the things that McKinsey does when we look at research is we look at flows, not just flows of goods or services, but lots of other flows as well. And Asia is taking an increasing share of flows globally. So here there's research published on this. Here you can see all sorts of different flows, whether it's energy, box office revenue, cargo traffic, etc. And in all of these, Asia has a material share. And in all of these, Asia's share is growing, bar one. The only one of these where Asia's share has not grown in the last year is actually global waste, where it fell 1%. Everywhere else, Asia's share is growing. The other, I think, important point is that much of these flows are intra-regional. So some people have an old paradigm in mind that Asia somehow is a manufacturer for the West, but the reality is quite different. So if you look at trade flows, FDI investment, startup investment, people flows, the majority of it is actually intra-regional within Asia. So Asian countries trading goods with one another, FDI investment going from one Asian country to another, startup investment in Asia typically originates in Asia, and also people flows. And that's, if you compare it to other regions in the world, rather, you'll see Asia is even more interregionally dependent than others. One example, interregional travel. If you look back historically, whereas the global, this is all obviously pre-COVID, global traveling was grown at 1.8x. In Asia, it was 2.7 within Asia. That is Asian people moving within Asia. And this is important as we think about the future and we think about Asia's interdependence, and perhaps the dependence on the West not being as high as previously thought. It's not all without challenge, though, and I wanted to highlight two. One is climate hazards, and this is obviously a global challenge. But within certain parts of Asia, if you take the extreme scenarios of a 2 to 4 degree increase in temperature by 2050, there will be very significant populations in Asia, especially in India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, where people will be living in areas with non-zero probabilities of lethal heat waves. And we've published research on this. So the imperative to address sustainability, to address carbon emissions I think is getting more and more acute in Asia. The other challenge, which is I find interesting, is around economic profit. So we've looked at, and for those, I guess, just to explain economic profit, is effectively economic profit is the profit left over when you've paid for your cost of capital. So when you've paid for your cost of debt and cost of equity, the profit you've got left over as companies. And we've done a big exercise to measure this around the world and over time. And what you'll see here is interesting is that over the last decade, roughly speaking, North America has more or less maintained a slight fall, but it's more or less maintained its level of economic profit. Asia's seen a very significant reduction. I mean, globally, we've seen a huge reduction in economic profit. And this does not necessarily mean that profit margins are falling, because this is, it can mean capital intensity is going up. So more and more investment is going in to deliver the same amount of profit, if you like. And that's really what we're seeing. And in Asia in particular, we're seeing a couple of things. One is that while from a revenue perspective and company size perspective, there's no question that Asia has significantly grown in its share. So for example, if you take the Fortune 5000, over 40% of those companies now come from Asia. And that's true for the Fortune 500, excuse me, Fortune 500, over 40% come from Asia. And if you look at the Fortune 5000, there are almost 1,000 companies from China alone. So in terms of its share of largest companies in the world, Asia is absolutely delivering, if you like. But when it comes to profitability, especially economic profit, it's different. Now, why is that? There are a few reasons. One is that listed companies everywhere in the world, it's nothing to do with Asia, everywhere in the world, typically perform better from an economic profit perspective than non-listed companies. That's one factor. The second is if you look at the industries where there are sectors that are, the sectors, excuse me, that typically or historically have consistently delivered higher levels of return on economic profit, it's in areas like tech, pharma, medical devices, where Asia is not as strongly represented as it is in other sectors. And there's also an issue with state-owned enterprises as well. In countries where you've got significant state-owned enterprises, research often shows that levels of economic profit are lower. So this is a challenge. And so Asia is attracting more than its share of investment and has more than its share of, or appropriate share, if you like, of large companies. But when it comes to returns, and especially economic profitability, it still has some way to go. We think about Asia, and there's many ways to break Asia down. Obviously, it's such a huge part of the world, but there are four Asias as we've thought about it. One is advanced Asia, which is the economies with the highest levels of GDP per capita. So Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, for example. Then we have China, which we think we regard as a region of its own, if you like. The third is emerging Asia, which is some of the larger economies in ASEAN, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, and so on. And the final is frontier Asia and India. These are the four, and they have unique characteristics that play different roles. They also complement each other. So if we look here, you see across the top, advanced Asia, China, emerging Asia, and then frontier Asia. If you look at innovation, and I know the number of patents is not necessarily a great measure of innovation, but it's a proxy for innovation. If you take that as a measure, China is obviously leading. Huge numbers of patents now being developed in China every year. Advanced Asia also significant. If you look at market, from a market size and growth perspective, China is very significant. Advanced Asia also a significant market. Emerging Asia and frontier Asia, not as big, but growing. And then from a labor market perspective, actually over the next 20 years or so, we'll see a decline in working age population. That's assuming the working age stays broadly the same. But broadly speaking, we'll see a decline in advanced Asia and indeed in China, as China ages. But we'll see significant growth in emerging Asia and frontier Asia. So if you like a source of innovation, China is a source of innovation in advanced Asia, markets coming from China and emerging Asia, labor coming likely from emerging Asia and frontier Asia. And then capital. A lot of capital flowing out of advanced Asia and to some extent China into emerging Asia and frontier Asia. The last point to say is one of cultural diversity, which is true actually across all of the Asias to differing degrees. And we're also seeing the growth, I think, in Asia's cultural influence in the world as well. But the point here is that the four different Asias play complementary in different roles. So an example of this is startup funding. As I mentioned, much of the startup funding in Asia is coming from other Asian countries. And here you can see the source of startup funding. In Japan, 84% of startup funding comes from within Japan. Extremely high, it's over half in China. Then if you look down at the bottom here, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, emerging Asia, you'll see that there's not much domestic capital coming in, but there's a huge amount of intra-regional capital, 75, 65, 83%. So a lot of capital invested in startups is coming from other parts of Asia. So Asia not dependent on the West by any means. for investment in startups. And we're also seeing some interesting economic corridors emerging. One, just to take one example, South Korea and Vietnam. So here you'll see the source of FDI inflows over 2013, 2017 into Vietnam. Almost 80% came from South Korea. Almost 80% came from South Korea. And then you'll also see that if you look at exports by sector, a significant amount coming from electronics. And it goes without saying that much of the investment in South Korea was obviously in where South Korea itself has many strengths in the electronic sector. So Vietnam is benefiting from that. There are many other examples of these corridors emerging. So that's the, if you like, a very quick summary of how we think about the future of Asia and Asia becoming more and more important, but also intra-regionally becoming more and more important. So what might the impact of COVID be? So when we looked at COVID, we've looked at a couple of things. We've looked at the impact on from a public health, from a lives perspective, and then we've looked at the impact from a livelihoods. So lives and livelihoods, if you like, is how we've thought about it. The scenarios I'm going to show you focus more on what the economic implications might be of COVID. And I should say they are scenarios, they're not projections. When we built these scenarios, we did them around two axes. The y-axis, the vertical one, is looking at the virus spread and the effectiveness of the public health response. So how quickly does the virus spread? How good a job do we do of containing the spread of the virus? The x-axis is the effectiveness of the economic policy response. So the stimulus packages, the relief packages, the support packages, we've seen many governments announce and implement, how effective they are protecting the economy. And then we look at the interplay of these and we see these 9 scenarios. So if you're in A4, for example, on the top right, that means that you expect a rapid and effective control of the virus spread, effectively one wave of lockdowns, and that a vaccine comes quite quickly. A4, you're also on the right-hand side of the x-axis, highly effective interventions. So here you expect that the government interventions are very effective, and therefore you have a V-shaped recovery in A4. The 2 scenarios we've highlighted in blue are A3 and A1. Both of these assume that the government interventions are partially effective. By the way, this is global, just to be clear, this is global. They're partially effective. The difference between A3 and A1 is that A3, we again assume a rapid and effective control of the virus spread. So effectively only one lockdown is required. A1 assumes the virus recurs and further lockdowns are required. And they're the 2 scenarios that we've focused on most of our modeling on. When we ask executives around the world what they think, which scenarios they believe, broadly speaking, 60% believe they're somewhere in the A. So somewhere in the 4, A1, A2, A3, A4, somewhere there in that territory. And another 40% are in the Bs, okay? Over time, since we started doing this survey in March, April, confidence has, I think initially it went down instead of April, May. It's been slightly rising in terms of people's outlook, but there's still a huge amount of uncertainty because we don't yet know how the virus is going to play out, whether we're going to face third waves or not. There's obviously been very good recent news on the effectiveness of vaccines, but that's yet to be to play out in terms of manufacturing and distribution at scale and seeing what actually the impact is from a public health perspective. So we're still dealing with very high levels of uncertainty. If we look at how these scenarios might play out in different regions of the world, under the modeling that we did, it looked at, look, China may emerge most quickly, emerging Asia would follow, and then the US and Europe would lag. Now, it's important to say that when we run these scenarios, we assume that the same scenario applies globally, right? We assume that the same scenario applies globally. And the reality, of course, may be different. And in fact, I think we're beginning to see that. But the logic for China emerging most quickly is that there was one significant lockdown, obviously. And the domestic economy, much of it has recovered relatively quickly in China. There's also a lot of focus on investment now and domestic investment in infrastructure and so on, which is helping to stimulate the economy. And those factors may well lead to China having coming out of this more quickly than other parts of the world. That's still a possibility. Now China is still dealing with outbreaks of the virus. So it's too early to be too certain on how you would predict this, but under this scenario at least, you would expect China to come out more quickly. By the way, I should explain, the left-hand side is the A3 scenario. That means that the virus is contained, so one lockdown. The right-hand side is a muted recovery, which effectively means the virus recurs and we have a second lockdown and it takes a bit longer to get to the vaccine. And when you look at that, you see the difference being that on the left-hand side, if the virus is contained, we would come out relatively quickly. And you would see that most parts of the world would recover to pre-crisis levels of economic activity by the end of this year or early next year. Now, these scenarios were done a few months ago. If you look now, obviously, with parts of Europe back in lockdown, including the UK right now, you can question whether this is actually going to hold. The right-hand side scenario is virus recurs. And the key difference between these two is that time to recovery becomes a lot longer on the right-hand side. So with the virus recurring, instead of seeing a sort of V-shaped recovery of end of this year, early next year, we're looking at taking a lot longer. And obviously some commentators are talking about, will we see another dip if we see a significant increase again in the virus in the winter. We've already seen an increase in the autumn in the West. So some uncertainty, but if you look at different regions, China may come out first in both, and then along with emerging Asia, and then potentially US and Europe would lag. Again, I say under these scenarios. I think if we step back and look at the numbers, it's going to be more complex than that. We're obviously seeing the US economy came back very strongly with the most recent numbers, but the US has obviously still got a significant battle in terms of containing the virus. So there is uncertainty. When we look at global economy, how is it done? So essentially, since we did this modeling back in the spring, it's largely followed the A3 scenario, which is effectively close to a V-shaped recovery. But the question mark is there because we've seen the recurrence of the virus. We've seen new lockdowns introduced. So the path we go to from here, a lot of uncertainty. If we step back and think beyond COVID, once we get through this period, what might the impact on the world be? There was a lot of debate about the new normal, the next normal, etc. And some people felt, look, we're going to go to a localized world. You know, national boundaries and borders are going to be reinstated even very significantly. We're going to see more protectionism, much more focus on domestic inequality and employment, etc. Other people felt, actually, no, technology is going to accelerate. We're going to be on the right-hand side. We're going to see a hyper-globalized world. And where we've sort of come out is more around an accelerated future, by which we mean COVID will accelerate many of the trends that were already with us prior to COVID. So examples of that are digital adoption by businesses, consumers, and governments. We've seen a massive acceleration in that. And globally, we've seen this. Consumer behavior has shifted. The rise in digital banking that we've seen in places like China, where it was already very significant, or e-commerce. And so that's one. The urgency of reskilling. With Industry 4.0, many jobs changing, the impact of automation, especially on jobs that are physically repetitive or that involve data processing and analysis. So there was already a view pre-COVID that many reskilling of the workforce would be required at scale. That's probably also been intensified and accelerated by COVID. We'll see more of that. Regionalisation of trades in Asia and rise of new flows, I think, again, we will see. And the early data suggests that inter-regional trade in Asia is recovering faster, for example, than trade elsewhere in the world. And then fourthly, increased corporate attention to risk management, supply chain diversification, and wider responsibilities. These were all there prior to COVID, but we see increased attention on these. A supply chain configuration being one example, where we'll see, companies will want to diversify risk, not be dependent on any one geography. By the way, in Asia, Southeast Asia, for example, for companies looking at alternatives to China, Southeast Asia typically comes out as the most attractive location. So we may see some movement in that direction as well. I'm actually going to skip over this because there's a lot of detail on the trends. So early thoughts on what the implications of all this are. So what may the opportunities be? The first is digitalization. So as I mentioned, we think we see an acceleration of Industry 4.0, an acceleration of machine learning, an acceleration of the Internet of Things. Companies will be investing in this more quickly and governments as well. And we think this creates a real opportunity for economic recovery, but especially we think for SMEs and mid-tier companies. That's what MTs are, mid-tier companies. So mid-tier companies are interesting because a lot of attention historically in governments focused on the SMEs, and particularly the smaller end of the scale of SMEs. But mid-tier companies are often the engines that drive employment growth in economies. We saw that in the US coming out of the financial crisis and the recovery there. We've seen it in Germany, obviously, with the Mittelstand. We've seen it in other parts of the world as well. But mid-tier companies are often the ones that, especially the well-performing mid-tier companies, have the real opportunities to scale and to grow and to create employment opportunities. And we think that is one significant opportunity from digitalization. A second is the future of work and reskilling. There will be a need to create future resilient jobs and redeployment and reskilling. It's important to say when we look at the disruption to the jobs market, there will be some jobs where if you like, the whole job will effectively no longer be required. That will happen. But a lot more of what we'll see is that significant activities within the job will be automated. But the job itself will stay, but just the skills requirement will become different as automation and technology change data. That's already been happening, but we see that happening more and more. And therefore, reskilling at scale is going to be an imperative, we think, for governments, but also for companies as well. The third is a shift in consumer preferences and a growing emphasis on quality. And we've seen, again, we saw this historically pre-COVID, but we're seeing it now again more and more, that consumers increasingly interested on quality and also health and safety when it comes to products. The fourth is resilience. There are some areas where we think there will become, we've already seen it, governments will want to create stronger domestic industries in areas like healthcare and also food security. They will look at securing their supply chains and they look at creating new trade relations to secure supply as well. And we'll see, we've already, I think, seen in the US, there'll be, I think, the development of medical devices, local manufacturing of pharma as well. That's likely to happen. We think we'll see this in Asia as well. In one example, Malaysia as a country imports 30% of its food, but it has a lot of land and a lot of land that with the potential for higher levels of productivity and yield. And we think we'll see this shift towards domestic healthcare development, but also areas like food. Environmental, social, and governmental goals. We've seen the EU has demonstrated this with if you look at their economic response to COVID, and over 200 billion being allocated towards new energy and sustainability. We're seeing that in Asia as well. China announced quite early on its new infrastructure, Stimulus, which was bringing forward some investment. And a big part of that was in areas like high-speed rail, but it was also in areas like renewable energy. And then there are areas like solar, where obviously China's already strong. But we think we're going to see an acceleration. We're already seeing it. We think it's going to be global, but also in Asia as well. An acceleration of the energy transition, growth in electrification, and growth in renewable energy, technologies like energy storage, and so on. And then the last is international flows. There will be, in time, new tourism opportunities while travel recovers. The travel industry has never seen a shock, obviously, like to compare with COVID, at least not in our lifetimes. But in previous shocks, we've seen domestic tourism come back very quickly. And that includes in Asia as well, by the way. So we've seen that in China already happen. Certainly domestic travel recovered very, very quickly in the spring and early summer in China. And we think in due course that will happen in other parts of Asia and globally as well. And that will create new opportunities for tourism too. And lastly, as I mentioned, there'll be opportunities for companies looking to diversify supply chain risk in the region. And we think Southeast Asia, countries like Vietnam and others as well, will be particularly attractive for companies who want to reduce their exposure to any particular economy. So I know I went through that very quickly. Let me sum up by saying Asia is already extraordinarily relevant and is only going to become more relevant as an economic region. Asia will be the intra-regional flows in Asia are extraordinarily important and as important as the extra-regional flows and flows with other regions in the world. Coronavirus, I'm happy to talk about this in more detail, but obviously has had a big impact economically in Asia, as it has everywhere. And by the way, the economic impact in Asia in some countries has been more severe than the public health impact. It's still too early to say what the recovery will look like and from COVID. But we think the longer term view is that the big impact will be an acceleration of pre-existing trends. And that acceleration of trends will create new opportunities for economies and businesses. Thank you.
Eoin, thank you. I'm not sure whether we have Roddy on the call, but fascinating stuff. I mean, if I may just ask a couple of questions. but perhaps the big one for me is when you look at those slides and you see the recovery for the US and Europe, it's long and slow. And the other surprising factor perhaps was the sort of regionalisation of activity within Asia. And so I just wonder, from a macro scale, how significant do you think we are at the moment as a turning point? And will, is it Asia moving out ahead and never to be caught again, or is it something less drastic?
Thank you very much. So first you say that was not a forecast, that was a scenario, and a scenario built some months ago, and one of many scenarios. I think if we look now at the data, I'd say a couple of things. One, I think we're seeing, and by the way, that scenario, as I mentioned, the way it was modeled was to assume that every country went through the same scenario. So effectively was similarly successful or unsuccessful in containing the virus, and was similarly effective in its economic response. The reality obviously is that there are differences in both of those. And I think what we're seeing economically is more divergence, actually. And I don't think it's as straightforward as to say Asia is going to march ahead and of the West. I think it's a lot more nuanced. I think we're seeing a recovery in China that's happening perhaps earliest, and that was to be expected. But we're also seeing there are differences across Asia. India has had more of the virus has had more of an impact from a public health perspective in India than it has in other parts of Asia, for various reasons. And that in turn has had a knock-on effect on the economy. So India's economy, I think the latest projections are for somewhere around a -8, -9% growth, reduction in GDP this year, which for a country like India, which India needs to grow at, the ideal growth rate is somewhere more like 8% positive for India, in order to create the long-term employment opportunities, given its demographics and given its very young, rapidly growing population. So I think if you look at, just take India as one example, Malaysia had a very severe dip in Q2 this year. I think it was close to 18% in GDP. It was very hard hit from an economic perspective. Malaysia moved very quickly and hard to contain the spread of the virus, but obviously there were economic consequences to doing that, and also what happened with the oil price also affected Malaysia as well. So it's quite nuanced across Asia, and I think we've also seen the US recovery over the last 2 quarters has been more rapid than many people projected. But what will happen going forward is still hard to predict. And then within Europe, we're seeing divergence as well. I think if we look at our own economy in the UK, we might be looking at somewhere close to a 10% fall in GDP. But it won't be that high in other parts of Europe, like Germany. But it'll likely be higher in places like Spain. So we think there's a lot more divergence going on than the headline numbers indicate. And secondly, it's also too early to predict. There's still too much uncertainty about how the virus itself is going to play out in the next months and frankly years, and also the effectiveness of the economic response and what the fiscal implications will be of the measures governments have put in so far.
Eoin Tang, I hope you can hear me okay, can you?
Yes.
The Asia Scotland Institute's core mission is to educate and inspire tomorrow's leaders in Scotland and elsewhere. And to that end, we're out to encourage, as I said, the next generation to acquire the skills and the knowledge to operate effectively in Asia. What would your advice be to younger people listening on this call about how best to prepare themselves for working in a part of the world where you were for many years?
Well, I think first thing I would say, I spent 10 years living in Kuala Lumpur, and before that, many years ago, I spent a year in China and other parts of Southeast Asia. So first thing I would say is if you get the opportunity, go. I think it's, certainly from a professional perspective, I think there's only upside, and it's an incredibly exciting time to be working in Asia. There are obviously very different parts of Asia, as I mentioned, and the proposition is different. So you should also figure out what's going to most excite you. There's, in developed Asia, you see in places like Korea, Japan, parts of Australia, you see that there is, and parts of China, by the way, you'll see there's leadership in certain areas of technology and everything else. In other parts of Asia, in emerging Asia, you've got very rapid economic growth and tremendous cultural diversity. So there are different propositions to different parts of Asia. And I would say, the other thing I would say is that really wherever you do go, understand the local nuances. I mean, it's an incredibly complex and diverse region of the world, and it takes time to understand that and to appreciate that. But I think, but it is well worth it, because you learn it, and it helps you not just professionally, but also from a personal growth perspective as well.
Thanks. Yeah, we certainly believe that understanding the many different cultures of Asia is critically important, because through understanding the cultural background, you can better do business with the people that you're talking to. So, Eoin, thank you for this fascinating presentation and talk. I'm going to ask Doug now if he would like to open this up to people who are on this webinar who've indicated they have some questions for you. Doug?
Well, thank you. We have a question from Robert Keel. I don't know if you'd like to ask your question, please.
Yeah, I have. Thank you for an interesting presentation. Having spent myself many years in China, but now also being back in Europe, I'm curious, how do you see the emerging tech divide? So we obviously kind of know how the Huawei 5G will pan out, with them not having access to the West, and China not giving access to Microsoft and Google and Facebook. But how do you see the sort of continuation of this? Will it be more severe, or will it sort of ease off?
Well, Robert, that's a very big question. I mean, I think it's hard to predict. The only thing I would say is that I think it'll be different in different parts of the technology stack. There are some areas where China's leading. There are many areas where the US and West still lead. Obviously, what we've seen in the most recent past is less cooperation and something of a decoupling. I think it remains to be seen whether we see a change in direction to that. It's hard to predict that right now. And certainly when we look at this, we effectively do scenario planning, because there are it's the geopolitical factors that are influencing the extent to which whether decoupling happens or not are not predictable. So therefore, I'm going to fall back and say we think you need to plan for all scenarios, including the potential of that the decoupling continues. Right now, there isn't. Right now, as we look, it's hard to point to something that suggests what we've seen in recent times is going to change. I would say that, but I can't say much more.
Owen, thank you. We have a question from Ewan Grant. Ewan, would you like to ask your question, please?
Where do we stand on strategic minerals? Do you see there is an issue there, particularly in the Asian region itself? We tend to hear it mentioned in the context of Africa, but of course there are many deposits of strategic minerals, not least copper, in the Asia-Pacific region. How do you think that one will play out?
In what respect, Ewan?
Basically, security of supply, trade, cooperation or competition. But thinking here of both the metals required for the internet world, which of course is just about everything, clean energy, and particularly electric vehicles.
Right. Well, I think it's a bit related to the previous question, right? Because I think the geopolitical, how that plays out will have an influence on to what extent there is collaboration versus cooperation on this. I'm not best placed, Ewan, to get into the specifics of different strategic minerals. I can try to point you to people who might be, but I can't say a lot more than that. As I was saying to Roddy, on geopolitics, we operate within it. Obviously, like everybody else, we're impacted by geopolitics at McKinsey, but it's not really it's not what we advise clients on. So there's a limit to what I can say on that topic.
Owen, thank you. We have a question from Jim Carroll. Jim, would you like to ask your question, please?
Yes, thank you very much, Owen, and good wishes from Dublin.
Thank you, Jim.
My question is simply, is there a sustainable energy transition scenario for shipping and for aviation?
When you say sustainable energy scenario, do you mean electrification, or what do you mean?
Well, yes, something that will chime with the pressures for climate measures.
Yeah. So look, I mean, I think the bigger picture is that what we've seen on the energy transition, we've seen and we think this is now going to accelerate, and there are a number of reasons for that. I think, but you know, I mentioned the EU's the 700 billion package, and how much of that is focused on sustainable energy. But we think electrification is, if done well, is not just a winner in terms of carbon emissions and climate change, but also in terms of efficiency and competitiveness of economies. We also think that the investment in new infrastructure, what we know is really helps economic recovery and job creation. I think one of the, as a simple example, I think one of the most effective investments in the US post the previous recession was in the retrofit to improve energy efficiency in buildings. But there are other larger infrastructure investments as well that we think are going to be central. So the other thing we're seeing is that the economics, the costs of renewable energy are becoming increasingly more competitive. I mean, that is clear. And that's going to continue. And also energy storage and the cost of batteries, et cetera, at scale. That is all moving. If you look at forecasts from 10 years ago, almost all of the reality is actually better than the forecast in terms of the decline in costs. So this is only going to accelerate. If you look at your specific question on aviation and shipping, obviously the challenge there is just, you know, from an engineering perspective, we'll see electric vehicles much faster in light vehicles than we will see in planes and large shipping. But there'll be other benefits from improved energy efficiency and so on as well. So in the long term, yes, but I think so the big picture, we see acceleration in the energy transition. Long term, no doubt technology will reach a point where that affects shipping and aviation as well. In the nearer term, it's going to play out much more in other forms of transport and also in industries and also in buildings.
I mean, there's obviously been concerns about Asia in terms of the way it operates, perhaps in terms of governance, also in terms of health and safety and work practices, and you know, labor, looking after the labor force, etc., and indeed environmental concerns. And I just wonder to what extent that remains a concern, and to what extent that may be perhaps slow progress.
Well, it's interesting because you're right, Doug, in the sense that from the West perspective, from a capital perspective, we're seeing a huge growth in capital going towards funds that are focused on ESG, and that's massively accelerated since COVID as well. I think if you look in Asia, I mean, my personal take on this is that we need to be a little bit patient, because there's no doubt that in certain parts of Asia, the environmental standards are not where they were in the West. But then we need to think about the journey the West went on over the last few decades. And we need to think about the journey that different parts of Asia and where they are at in that journey. My sense overall is, if I look at the last decade in Asia, there's been a very rapid acceleration and much more focus specifically on environment and sustainability than there was before. And obviously we've seen in China's in many ways leading in terms of the development, for example, of solar technologies globally. So, and I think we're going to see that continue. But I don't think we can have necessarily the same expectation straight away that we have of the West, because we're dealing with parts of Asia where we have you still have, you know, significant deficits in terms of power generation. You've got rapidly growing economies. You've got very young populations, and the industrialization that path that they are on to raise living standards, lift people out of poverty, is going to continue. So it's going to be a little bit different, but I also think that the shift towards more environmental responsibility is already happening, and I suspect they'll get there quicker than we did, you know, relative to the pace of development. That's what, and I think we need to acknowledge that and be a little bit show some understanding and patience around that as well.
Thank you. And perhaps one further one from me. On one of your slides, when it was talking about the potential scenarios on the right-hand side, and you were talking about hyper-specialization. I think I might know what you're describing, but perhaps you could enlighten me.
Yeah, let me just put that up. So, give me 1 second. This is in terms of the where the world might go. So just give me 1 second.
Yeah, potential outcomes. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Essentially, what this is saying is that you would move to a world where, I mean, in simple language, as you're moving from the left to the right, you're saying, are we very localized or are we very globalized? And if you believe in the right-hand side, hyper-globalized, you're saying the technology effectively breaks down boundaries. And that, you know, you can work from wherever, you can focus on very specific skills. And what you will see is if you are particularly skilled in a particular area, you can be globally relevant. There'll be more global competition. And therefore, so where you are won't matter. Like being the best person in town in a particular skill is not going to matter. Physical interactions are not going to matter. We're going to see a rapid acceleration of the adoption of technology that will get globalized, and we will therefore see a slowdown in the growth of cities, and we will see people and companies becoming more and more specialized in certain skill sets that they can then effectively trade on globally. That's what it.
My question is specifically about that hyper specialization. So, are you describing parts of the world just becoming very, very specialized in particular niche areas, and,
yes,
and they then provide the world with that particular
correct
capability? Or
exactly,
yeah,
exactly right. That's exactly what it means.
Understood. Thank you very much indeed. So, I'm just checking now to see if we've got any further questions.
Doug, I've got one. While you're looking,
please, Roddy. Yes.
Oh, and yeah, there's been a lot of talk about supply chain management and the vulnerability of supply chains in a COVID pandemic environment. And you talk about specialization. And in some ways, Adam Smith, who's died and buried in the Canongate Kirk here, would have identified with that, I think. What do you see happening to supply chains, and what do you see happening to the production of important materials and things being brought closer to home?
Yeah, it's a very good question, Roddy. So again, it will vary, but I think in certain areas, as I mentioned, I think that there'll be a government response where I think certain governments in certain parts of the world will want to increase security. They will want to have if you like, security. Healthcare and food are the two that stand out, right? Where they will want to feel, we're not dependent on, we can be independent to some extent on those, or at least we can have real security. If we can't be independent, we can have real security in our supply chains. We think that we're likely to see some of that play out, and therefore the development of domestic industry, whether it's the manufacturing of, whether it's pharmas or PPE or medical devices and so on. We think that we'll see that happening. Food security, by the way, was already a priority for many governments prior to COVID. We think that will also be. But the other thing I'd say is that there may be, for geopolitical reasons or for climate risk reasons, companies will want to diversify risk and not be geographically concentrated. Because in a world, I think what we've seen from COVID is that the borders suddenly came up again or came down again, depending on how you think about it, including within the EU. That's not something that I think a lot of people hadn't factored in when they were thinking about their risks to their supply chain. And I think now that has happened, people will now factor it in. So that means there will be people will seek to de-risk and reduce to be concentrated either for geopolitical risk or for climate risk in any particular region. We saw that before, by the way, when there were natural disasters and floods in different parts of the world, how companies sought to rebalance and diversify and have alternative sources of supply. And then the last thing I'd say, though, is that overall supply chains have held up very well. I mean, that's the other thing I think we would say from COVID relative to some of the nervousness at the beginning of this and through lockdowns and so on. At least for essential products, overall supply chains have held up quite well. But we think we will see some reconfiguration. We also think we'll see, as I mentioned, Southeast Asia, we'll see investment coming in. That's partly, by the way, because Southeast Asia is such an attractive market. 700 million people growing, it's had political instability at a country level, but at a regional level, it's actually been performing well overall and consistently so. It has got natural resources, it's got a relatively young population, it's got many positive things. So they're not just about, some of the configurations not just about de-risking, it'll also be about positioning to capture future growing markets.
Thank you.
Owen, thank you. We have a question from Sunil. Sunil, would you like to ask your question, please?
Thanks, Doug. Thanks, Roddy. Thanks, Owen, for your excellent presentation, which I thoroughly enjoyed. My name is Sunil Shastri. I'm a consultant, expert, and speaker in ocean and environmental governance. It just a thought that your focus is on Asia, though, but the population circle, where it says that the circle of population where half the population lives is currently on Asia. Now that circle is moving inexorably towards Africa. Yeah. So how is that going to affect Asia?
Oh.
And my second question, very, very similar to that, and taking on from what Roddy had said earlier about inspiring young generation, etc. China is going to have a drastic reduction in population and drastic aging population, and India is going to be the opposite of that. So do you think this great influx of Indians wanting to go to China, because obviously China is this great sort of scientifically and technologically advanced country. I mean, it is, well, going really quickly in that direction too. Thank you. Two directions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So the rise of Africa, if you like, which we've written about as well, by the way. So that's also in the public domain. And China's obviously played an important part in that. We looked specifically at China because I think short answer is rising Africa is an opportunity for Asia, and more than anything else. I think that's the sort of short answer. And I think we looked at China's investments in China going to Africa, and there was something like, when we looked at the research, 10,000 private companies from China who are investing in all sorts of sectors and creating a lot of employment. And actually the management teams were roughly 50% local and so on as well. There's actually the net was there was positive economic benefit of a lot of private capital from Asia and from China in particular going into Africa. That helps Africa, and I think the growth of Africa as a market can only help. Is only a positive thing. I only see that as a positive thing. I think, by the way, the challenge for Africa and for some parts of frontier Asia, the model where you are effectively a low-cost manufacturing center, there's a question about how sustainable that will be going forward. Partly because investments in technology will make productivity so important, and labor inputs are only a part of the productivity equation, obviously. And the cost of labor input prices, I should say, the cost of wages. So I think I think there's going to be a common challenge that Africa and that frontier Asia will face, is that can we develop and industrialize on the basis of having low wages? And I think the short answer is that's unlikely to be enough. You're going to need to be also to create the right ecosystem and also the right levels of productivity, so that it's attractive for investors and private capital and FDI beyond just the low input prices. But I think on the whole, Africa's rise is only a positive thing. It'll create new markets, etc. The second part here, India. I mean, India. So India and China have gone. You're right that the demographics are quite different. That China will age well before, and India is still growing as a population. I think India will overtake China in population any day now, if it hasn't already. It's very, very close to that, and it's going to continue to grow. I think there are, given the scale, India historically obviously and we've benefited from this in McKinsey as well, has been a source of talent for the world in the US and Europe. That will likely continue. But I think for India's perspective, a lot will come down to what happens domestically. India needs to grow to create the employment it needs, given its demographics. It needs to grow, I think, at 8.5% consistently, because its population is growing, its workforce is growing. That means the per capita growth will be lower than that. So for India to grow at 8.5% is going to require, quite an uplift in its economic performance. It's been very hard hit by COVID, as you know, from a public health perspective, firstly, but also from an economic perspective as well. And one of the things that we've observed is that India needs more, it needs more great Indian companies, to put it simply. If you look at the top tier of Indian companies, there should be more at scale than there are, given the size of the country and given the potential of the country. And in particular, the sort of middle tier that I mentioned before, the 50 million to 500 million revenue companies, that's where India, when we look at the pyramid or the ladder of companies, that's where we see there's a gap, frankly. So I think for India, addressing the development of its domestic industry is going to be by far the most important thing. I think China will, again, depending on geopolitics, obviously, but China can create opportunities for India and vice versa in many respects. But I think the key for India will actually be what happens with its domestic economy and the development of domestic champions.
Thank you.
Owen, thank you very much indeed. Our hour is almost up, and so I think it behoves me now to draw matters to a close. Your subject was the future of Asia, and you've led us through a fascinating discussion on that. It's sometimes worth recalling that 200 years ago, the two biggest economies in the world were, as you and I know, India and China. And so what goes around comes around.
Indeed.
And I think you've also pointed towards some of the great demographic challenges that exist. Aging populations, still young populations. And so on behalf of everybody at Asia Scotland Institute, and to all those listening on the webinar today, I'd like to thank you most sincerely for not quite fresh off the boat from Kuala Lumpur, but anyway, back in London, for giving us such a fascinating opportunity to look at Asia and its future today. So thank you and McKinsey very much indeed.
My pleasure, Ollie. Thank you. Thanks everybody for listening to me as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.